The West, mining. So we're actually going to be looking at three different sections on the West. Basically, we're going to look at mining, ranching, and agriculture or farming. And so I want to talk about mining first, but keep in mind there's definitely going to be themes that you see here that are going to repeat in the other two sections as well. So when it comes to mining, opportunities actually out west were frequently short-lived. It's rarely also going to be available for all because it's pretty expensive as mining goes on. But really, mining is going to be the first step to integrating the West into a modern national economy. Of course, when people think of mining, they immediately think of like searching for gold and silver. It's going to be a lot more than that. We're also going to see a lot of these mining enterprises found like the first communities that eventually will stimulate like railroad growth and then eventually bring more development, thus ranching and farming. So we have our rushes, of course. Generally, people think of like the gold rush and especially like the California gold rush, the 49ers and everything like that. But we do have other gold rushes as well, such as like in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado in 1859. And really the last of the frontier gold rushes comes in about 1874 in the Black Hills of South Dakota. But later on, you do see other minerals still shaping the frontier. So like you can see in this picture, silver mines in Nevada, you find silver and lead in Colorado and Idaho, silver and copper in Arizona and Montana. And the thing is, these different enterprises would mean that some sort of community had to be formed. And these communities would be basically mining camps. Now, these mining camps are oftentimes going to be really isolated, partly because of the distance from things like the railroad and everything like that, and then the terrain. A lot of times they were really, I say mining camps because there wasn't necessarily permanent structures initially. It will, though, contribute to permanent structures eventually because it basically will encourage the agricultural industry and transportation to come through different areas at different times. You also see it's kind of an unusual social and economic structure out west. The population tends to be mostly male because they're the ones going and mining more often than not. You do have women, though. Women tended to have less opportunity there, thus you don't have quite as many women, and if they do come, they rarely did work outside of the home. Most of the time it was things like they would run hotels, they'd be cooks, do washing, but really the largest source of paid employment for women was prostitution. Now, you can't talk about the West and not talk about prostitution because really these two things went hand in hand. And this was a way that a lot of women actually managed to have power in their different communities in the West. That being said, it didn't necessarily mean success automatically if a woman was a prostitute. We do see, like during this time period as pictured here, Chinese women would oftentimes be sold into prostitution. This was one of those things that unfortunately led a lot of Americans to have even more nativist beliefs because then they started associating these Chinese women as, oh, Chinese women are loose, and you get all of that nativist sentiments towards the Chinese, and thus we have like the Naturalization Act and everything like that. They would cite things like this, even though these women, it wasn't their choice to be in this situation. That being said, you do have other women, though, involved in prostitution, and all of these women would face things like violence, alcoholism, disease, drug addiction, and like poverty. On top of that, authorities really had very little concern for if these women were abused or even murdered a lot of times, though authorities did like to fine these women to raise revenue for the community. So. You do have some like Protestant women trying to help prostitutes and with like rescue homes, but very little of these are going to have any kind of success. So jumping back to the mining camps and everything, society in the West in these mining camps oftentimes is known as saloon society. That's because the saloon really was the most prevalent of all the local businesses. It was really the social center of town. You also are seeing that it's a male-dominated saloon society, meaning that you're going to generate social conflict. A lot of men are going to drink basically at all times of the day because they're going to drink when they feel like it, quite frankly, because there wasn't much else to do. But this is going to push forward ideas like bad manners and violence and disputes over mining. And so actually, when you look at things like homicide rates, it tends to be higher in these communities than most cities. Though actually, day-to-day life was still pretty safe. We have this idea of what violence in the West was, and that, you see all the different movies and people are killing people left, right, and center. The real truth of the matter was, when it came to like personal and criminal violence, that was actually less pervasive than collective violence, and specifically violence due to racial discrimination. Now, like European immigrants, there was a lot less hostility towards them, but non-white minorities are really going to suffer a lot of this collective violence the most. The Chinese were specifically the biggest target. Oftentimes, the Chinese people were not allowed to do like higher paid occupations, and so they would kind of retreat and make their own communities and maintain their own customs. And then you get violence outright against these different parts of town. So a great example of this is the violence that destroyed Denver's Chinatown in 1880. You have members of an all-white mob basically are very clearly known to have attacked the Chinatown in Denver, and yet the jury found no cause for any legal action to be taken against any of these individuals. So jumping back to the actual labor though, so like we talked about society, but what about mining itself? So initially, a lot of mining enterprises was like individual enterprises using simple tools, shallow surface deposits, but these kinds of deposits are going to be quickly exhausted. And so when it comes to more complex operations, it's going to be a lot more expensive to reach precious metals much deeper into the earth. So how did they do this? They would do it through things like hydraulic mining. Hydraulic mining basically used high pressure water cannons, but that's really expensive. And then other mining enterprises would be like for like quartz or lode mining, and you needed a lot of money and technology and time, because basically for those kinds of minings, you can kind of see here, they'd have these underground chambers and tunnels that they had to build, but they have to basically pull out like all the water and then be able to lower men down into these areas, but then they have to be able to get big rocks out of these areas. And so more and more often we see a lot of mining enterprises come under corporate control. And that's the thing, is we're going to have, corporate mining has drastic effects on multiple parts of society. The first part it impacted was the huge impact on the environment out west. So like when they did like the hydraulic mining, the high pressure water cannons, they weren't very good about limiting it, and so they would wash away like entire hillsides, clog up rivers, cause floods, bury hundreds of acres of farmland underwater. Eventually, there was enough public outcry against this, though, that you do get government regulation when it comes to hydraulic mining. Corporations, though, affected society, though, as well, because really they could hurt miners. A lot of times corporations would invest in machinery that could replace skilled workers, and so that takes away a lot of opportunity from individual miners. And then on top of that, there was very little done to protect miners' health or safety. A lot of miners died in like cave-ins, explosions, fires, the great heat from working underground, or poisonous gases in underground mines. And they could contract all kinds of diseases or be killed or crippled by machinery that they were using, which would lead a lot of miners to form unions. So hopefully you're already recognizing there's kind of some similarities here to what we've been looking at previously. So when it comes to unions, a lot of these unions, while they're going to fight for like proper wages and mine safety and actually convince states to like pass mine safety laws, these unions also would set up things like benevolent societies so they could aid like injured miners or survivors. And they're gonna contribute by making like hospitals and libraries in their towns, which also brought like an alternative to the saloon to a lot of these towns. We do see violence though against these unions. Companies are gonna frequently use like state power to crush unions and crush any kind of striking. And so a lot of times the violence we see at this time is not because of like frontier lawlessness, but it's more about the industrialization of the mines and the fact that these corporations used violence to put down these unions and keep them from striking and everything. Still, you're seeing mining had gone from being a small scale enterprise to being large scale like corporate businesses. So I ask you this, and I want you thinking about this especially because I want you to see if there's any themes that repeat in the next two videos. What is the most important point about mining in the West, in your opinion? And what had the largest impact?